We're going to read from verse 9 of James chapter 1 through to verse 18. So the kind of second half of the first column. Let me pray, then I'll read, and then we'll dig in. Let's pray together. Loving Father, may your voice be heard this morning. May we hear of Jesus. May we be captivated by him. May we recognize what it means to be set free to obey Christ. Father, as we hear your word, as we hear it preached, soften our hearts and angle them toward you. In Jesus' name, amen. What is your retreat strategy? What is the way that you respond when things are hard, when you've had a difficult week, when something doesn't go the way that you expect or the way that you want? What's your retreat strategy? What do you tend to do when things get difficult? We want to have that question in the back of our minds as we read from James chapter 1 and verse 9. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because, like a flower of the grass, he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flower falls, and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then, desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. This is God's word. God's word cannot be broken. One of the most popular tropes in movies is the rousing speech before the battle. Aragorn before the Black Gates. It is not this day. Wallace telling his troops that they should give up their lives rather than their freedom. Ted Lasso telling his troops about the Denver Broncos to G them up for the second half. The great leader knows how to put a story, a narrative, into the hearts of the people in front of him, to keep the troops firm when they face their enemy, to remind them that there is something that lies in front of them that is not just the battle, something more, something bigger, something greater. The story that we buy into affects how we respond to what is breaking round about us, to the situations we find ourselves in. That is the theme that works its way through James's next few verses. Last week we began to hear about how we go about facing difficulties, asking God for wisdom. And now James wants to fix in our hearts the true story of God, a narrative that will teach us how we can stick with Jesus. What is it, James is asking, that needs to be fixed in my heart, in your heart, so that when we are faced with temptation, we will choose to stick with Jesus? What is the story that we need in our hearts? What do we need to know to be true? So there's three things that I will touch on today, three big truths that James wants us to cling on to. And those big truths are designed to put that story into our hearts so that when temptation, when difficulty breaks around us, we will stand with Jesus. There's again and again in the verses, last week and this week, there's talk of steadfastness, of standing, of not changing. It's a characteristic of God, but it is something that James wants applied into the life of the believer. He believes that the believer, the Christian, should be steadfast like the God whom we serve. So what do we need to know? What do we need to believe in order that we might be steadfast, that we might stand? So the first big truth then is that we need to believe that plenty won't make us happy. Plenty won't make us happy. James introduces themes and he circles around them, he comes back to them, he dots off and looks at other things, and he kind of jumps around a little bit, but he often comes back to the same themes in different ways. And one of the themes that he introduces, that he circles around to throughout the letter, is that the way that the world judges reliability, security, power, shouldn't be trusted by God's people. He flips our normal perspective, the way that we normally think, on its head. Whose heart should be cheering? That's the word boast, means the thing that makes your heart cheer, the thing that lifts your heart up. What is it that James says? The person who is oppressed, the person whose net worth is zero, is the one that he says first should boast, should cheer. And why is it that that person's heart should cheer? Because actually, James says, that person has high status, not low status. Which sounds strange if you say it slowly. It's the exact opposite of what we believe to be true. And what is it that should make your heart cheer if you have lots, if you have plenty, if you have a full bank account? What is it James says? Being on the bottom rung, being of low status, that's what should make your heart cheer if you have plenty. James isn't saying that Christians should seek poverty and shun plenty. There are ways that having a lot makes it more difficult to be a Christian. James goes on to talk about that later on. But in this case, he's not saying there's a moral evil in having a lot, in having plenty. James is telling people who find themselves in that state what it is should make your heart cheer. We can't rely on what the world around us teaches us to expect, what our hearts naturally expect. Because wisdom from God, the wisdom that we ask God for, doesn't look like business wisdom. Again and again, one of the things that happens in the book of James is that he re-educates our affections, what we've learned to love. He re-educates the way that we analyze the data that comes in from the world around us and respond to it. Throughout the letter, James wants us to put on our God goggles. That's when he talks about wisdom, he wants us to see the world through God's eyes. Our hearts, your heart, my heart, are tuned to love plenty because it seems to give us security. Our hearts are taught to cheer when we can pay our mortgage or our rent. Our hearts are taught to cheer when our job offsets the life that we want to live, when our income guarantees the life to which we would like to become accustomed. We shouldn't lose the nuance in what James is saying. James wants us to learn that yes, our hearts should cheer in security, but actually high wealth produces low security. That's what James says. High wealth teaches us dependence on a bank account. High influence teaches us dependence on people that we can control. High wealth should make our heart cheer because more and more it should make us realize that we have nothing that secures ourselves. High wealth teaches us normally to rely on things that aren't reliable. The illustration that he gives is that every one of us is subject to things that we can't control. If you have plenty, if your bank account is full, it's easy to believe that you're in control. The illustration that he gives is of a wildflower. A wildflower looks beautiful out in the field. It is precious. It is the thing that draws your eye in the field. But as soon as the sun comes up, it's toast. The temporary beauty of that wildflower is wiped out by a power that's so much bigger than the flower itself, by the sun, by the heat. Its beauty is no defense against something that is so much more inevitable than the flower could ever understand. And that's what it's like, James says, if you have wealth and security and influence. Seen up close, it is beautiful. It's desirable. But you put on the God goggles and you are zoomed out to see the real picture. The beauty of wealth is fragile. It is no defense for the wealthy against an end that is coming. As the wealthy person carries on with their life unperturbed, a single event causes them to vanish. That's what James says. Whether it's a market plunge, a bank that's been shattered, a bad business choice, a grim diagnosis, he comes to an end just as much as the wildflower in the field. No, James says, wealth is not the guarantor of happiness that you've learned to think it is, Christian. No, the one who is truly happy is the one who, after temptation has tried its best, has tried to hook you and make you behave the way it wants you to, is still standing. The one who is whole, the one who is in the same shape after temptation has had its try. Being unchanging, being steadfast is what matters. That is the heart of the wisdom that James is offering us in these verses. Not being molded, being shaped by every invitation to think like a human instead of like God. Being obedient to Jesus, that's what lasts in a way that the wildflower doesn't, in a way that having plenty doesn't. It takes a lifetime of being retaught to learn this, to teach our hearts and our minds and our eyes and our affections to desire, to understand, to see, to love differently from what we're taught every moment of every day. One of the hardest practical things I ever had to learn was to learn how to breathe properly. When I was at high school, I was an oboe player. The first 3 years at high school, my woodwind instructor, the man who taught me, was a lovely guy. He's a flute player. I don't have anything against flautists. Some of my best friends are flautists. He was a good general woodwind player. He taught me how to do the fingerings, how to play the notes, how to understand the theory, but he taught me to breathe like a flute player, not like an oboe player. And then as I was getting to the stage where I was struggling with more complex pieces, I was struggling to get through the longer phases and the more complex notes and sections. But then in my fourth year, a new woodwind instructor came to the school. She happened to be an oboe player herself. And she spent the first 6 months unteaching me how I breathed. She taught me to think differently about how much oxygen and carbon dioxide I had in my lungs at different moments in time, to think about how I inhaled and exhaled, how I used that inhale and exhale as I was playing the notes. And you don't realize how difficult it is to breathe until you have to think about it every time you do it. It felt like I was doing it wrong. I felt like I was getting worse as an oboe player for 6 months. It felt like I was getting worse as a human being because I just couldn't breathe properly. But eventually, she taught me how to play in a way that enabled me to play the more complex pieces, to handle my airflow in a way that actually worked for what I was trying to do. It was difficult because I felt like I was doing the wrong thing because I was unlearning something so fundamental to the way that I was. That is what James is trying to teach us to do here, to unlearn something that we all believe is fundamental. We hear it every day. Learning to believe what James says in these verses, that plenty is not what will make us happy, that human security is not what will make us happy, not to judge stability by short-term benefits, but in the scope of eternity, it will feel wrong. It will feel uncomfortable for us every day because nothing else in the world is teaching us to think like that. It feels different and difficult because it's different from how we're wired. But, James says, this is about life and death. It is incredibly important. Because, he says, when you stand unchanged, steadfast on the other side of what the world wants you to do, how it wants you to disobey God, God will give you a crown. And that crown is life that lasts forever. It is the thing that God guarantees to the people who love him. It's what Jesus talked about again and again in Matthew's Gospel. In the latter section of Matthew's Gospel, again and again we hear about Jesus who brings life that lasts forever, the crown of life to those who stand firm. Underpinning all of James's words in these verses is what Jesus said in John chapter 14, that if you love me, you will obey me. That is what a believer looks like, someone who loves Jesus and therefore obeys him. So that's the first thing that we need to learn to believe, that plenty will not make us happy. The second thing that James wants us to believe is that your big problem is not God's fault. Your big problem is not God's fault. All the way through verses 2 through to 18, there's two things that keep coming up, two ideas: trials and temptations and testing and proving. Those two themes keep intermingling. Trials and temptations are what we want to do in particular situations, how we want to respond to them. Testing and proving, when James talks about that, are what those circumstances produce, what they lead to. James gives us a description in these verses of how trials and temptations work. But first, he gives us a warning. He says, God is not to blame. The human instinct is always to find someone to blame when things go wrong or when we mess up. And God is not to blame. Don't make the mistake of shifting responsibility, James says. God is sovereign. He is in total control, but he is not to blame for my disobedience. I am not a robot who is being coerced by God to reject him. I own my own judgment. All the way through the passage, when we see either trial or temptation, behind the scenes is the same word that James is using. It's sometimes translated differently, but we should read it as effectively the same words throughout these verses. And Richard picked this idea up last week, and we'll see it again here, that temptation is something that Christians deal with day by day, and it is something that we need to learn how to deal with. It's not something that God himself experiences because, James says, it is the response of a corrupt heart. Temptation is the response of a corrupt heart to what is happening to us, a heart that wants the wrong things. Therefore, it's not something that God experiences because God's heart is not corrupt. God's heart is not mixed, like the double-minded man in verse 8. Trials and temptations are the result of wanting the wrong thing, loving the wrong thing or the wrong person, desiring the wrong thing, prioritizing the wrong thing, which is something God never does. A heart that loves the wrong thing is vulnerable, James says. It can be seduced. It can be called away from its post. Our heart, God's law says, is to love God completely, to obey God as our maker. But corrupt hearts, they can be distracted. Our hearts are meant to point toward God in every decision. But our corrupt hearts can be pulled to point in another direction. James says that's what your heart and my heart is like. Your heart and my heart, they are split, they are mixed, they're polluted. We know we're meant to love God, but we get captivated by anything else, by everything else all the time. The kind of imagery that James uses is of a soldier at his post, given a job to do, but who is given a promise of something that seems enticing, seems worthwhile, makes it worth abandoning his job for a moment. And that moment when the heart is pulled away from its post by anything other than obeying God all the time, that, James says, leads to an unexpected pregnancy. The fruit of a disobedient, polluted, mixed heart being pulled away from its post is sin. Sin is not just the bad things that we do, James says. Sin is the product of having already decided to disobey God. Sin comes from a heart that's already corrupt, that has already decided to love God less than something or someone else. And as that sin grows up, it turns into death. Death is sin matured. Sin is not loving God enough to obey him all the time. And that is why the biggest problem that we have is not God's fault, because sin comes from our decision to love God less than we should. The double-minded person of verse 8 is problematic because his heart tries to love two masters, and God demands utter loyalty. So when James talks in these verses about trials and temptations, he's talking about anything that presents us with an opportunity to split our loyalty between God and anything else, anyone else. He's not talking about just generic bad diagnoses, not talking about just losing our jobs or even just people making fun of us or singling us out because we're Christians. Those circumstances can lead to trials and temptations, but in and of themselves, they're not the trial and temptation. He's talking about how we want to react to those circumstances. And we want to react to them in a way that dishonors God. Our retreat strategy is to do something that dishonors and disobeys God. How we want to respond to a fight that we've had with our spouse by punishing them in retaliation. How we want to justify ourselves when our boss shouts us down by bad-mouthing them to all of our colleagues. How we want to respond to the bully, to having a broken friendship by treating parents badly in response. The problem James addresses is not per se the fight with the spouse or the bad boss or the bully, but what we want to do in response to that. The testing that James talks about is what our response shows about where our loyalties lie. When our heart has been set free by Jesus, we no longer have to dance to temptation's tune. Sometimes we still make the mistake of giving in to it. Our biggest problem is that when we choose loyalty to what our corrupt hearts want rather than what God commands, our choices ultimately lead to death and not to the happiness held out to us in the moment in front of us. James wants us to know that it is a choice. It is our responsibility and it is our fault that we get death. When bad happens, the double-minded person abandons their post, runs away after what our heart promises, and ultimately finds nothing but death. So those are the first two things. The third thing that James wants us to believe is not to be duped. He wants to teach us positively what to love, who to love. He says finally that you will be happiest if you obey God. You will be happiest if you obey God. Everything that you have ever experienced, James says, everything that is good comes from heaven's storehouse. Everything. Everything good that you have ever had, every moment that you have ever savored, every elation, every victory, every sweetness, every joy, everything comes from God's hand. And God, he says, doesn't change. There is not the merest whisper of an alteration in God. He doesn't give good one moment and then the next substandard. If everything good you have ever had is from God, James is saying, then nothing that comes from God is mixed, bad, weak, substandard. God does not change his mind, doesn't change his purpose. His own choice, his determined decision that cannot change, that is that he will not be distracted in producing something. Just as our decision to abandon God produced death, James tells us that God's settled, confirmed, unchanging decision leads to life that lasts forever. A choice from our wavering, corrupt, and yearning hearts brings death, but a choice from the Father of lights, the one who features not the merest quark of change, who speaks what is true and not what is false, brings life. To his people, purely because he decides it and because he is completely truthful and unchanging, he will make his people the most holy, valuable part of what he is doing in the universe. And so James holds out an incentive to obey God, to be loyal to him. God gives us the offer of life when instead we would naturally choose death. We can choose loyalty to our broken and corrupt hearts, or we can choose loyalty to the one from whose hand came everything good that you or I have ever experienced. You have never had anything good from anywhere else. Only death springs from our natural decision-making, and good only comes from God. By his choice, because Jesus has obeyed perfectly, we are set free to be able to choose to obey God in a way that was not possible for us before. People who trust Jesus can begin to make a choice. People who learn to choose to obey God, the Father of lights, those are the people who demonstrate that they have a new loyalty. We are incapable of making that choice until Jesus sets our hearts free. People who are not Christians cannot, in any decision, make a decision that shows that they belong to God. People who are not Christians cannot make any decision that leads to anything other than death. But we demonstrate that Jesus has set our hearts free by, in every situation, good and bad, resisting the choice to follow what our corrupt hearts want, and instead choosing to obey Jesus. That is what standing steadfast and firm look like in James's economy. Not to save ourselves with our performance, but because we have already been saved, because Jesus has lived this already and made our hearts free, he has made it possible for us to choose life. And because when we do that, we are offered the crown of life. We are able now to choose life because Jesus has set our hearts free. There's one big implication I want to rest on briefly as we finish, as we think about what James has said in these verses. And that's this. This week, practice choosing life instead of death. This week, practice choosing life instead of death. If you're a Christian, make use of this ability that you didn't have until Jesus gave it to you. If you're not a Christian, you cannot make the right choice. You are incapable of making a choice that leads to anything other than death. So don't try. Don't try and perform to God's level. Ask instead Jesus to free your heart, to belong to him so that you can begin to make choices that lead to life. In each choice that we make this week, we're given two roads. Abandon your post or stand firm. Those are the two choices we can make in every decision. Abandon your post, stand firm. Death or life. Practice this week thinking through every decision, being thoughtful about what you choose. Every conversation, every relationship, every show that you watch on TV, every article that you read, every tweet that you send. Be thoughtful about the choice you make. This week there's a TV show that I love watching. I really enjoy it, and I'll continue to watch it. And it was glorifying at one point something that God calls sin. It was asking us to celebrate something that God says, this is wrong, this is disobedient to me. I'm not going to talk about the specifics of it, but that's what the writers of the show wanted me to respond with, to celebrate something that God calls sin. And in my heart, because I love the characters, because I love the show, I wanted to cheer the character. I wanted to celebrate what they said. And I had to fight my heart to remember that God called something sin, and so it wasn't my choice to call it anything else. Sometimes my colleagues will say something or do something that I, as a Christian, shouldn't be celebrating. And the easiest thing for me to do is to say, that's great, well done, congratulations. And yet I know it's not what God wants. My decisions about what I do with my money are often driven by my stomach or my comfort. My decisions about my time are often driven by what is convenient for me or what is fun for me. I was joking with a friend this week about whether I could get away with having a football match on in the corner of my laptop screen during an elders meeting because I really wanted to watch the football game. I didn't. I did have my attention devoted to the elders meeting, I promise. Don't trust what your heart wants. None of us can trust what our heart wants. What our hearts want is warped, is corrupt. But, Christian, Jesus has saved you. He has set your heart free. It will feel many times a week that you, when you choose life, are making choices that are filled with friction. That the obedience of a faithful Christian will feel like pushing two similarly poled magnets together. I don't know if you ever had kind of fridge magnets or the kind of little kind of clacky magnets that if you bring them together, they push each other away. And that's what it feels like when we follow James's advice sometimes. But this week, let's be thoughtful about our decisions. Let's help one another to check our hearts and our affections. What is it that your heart wants from this conversation? When you ask your mum and dad something or tell them something, what do you want from it? What do you want to get out of that meeting at work? What is it you hope you will learn or gain from listening to this song or sending that picture on Instagram? Don't trust your heart and what it wants, because James wants us to put on our God goggles. The whole world, everything around us, is a demand on our loyalty. And because of Jesus, we have a chance to choose life with each decision, a chance that was not ours before, because Jesus has set our hearts free to choose life. The crown of life awaits the Christian who gets into the habit of choosing to stand obediently with Christ and doesn't consistently wander off what our hearts yearn for, who rejoice in the crown of life that is ours. Let's pray together. Loving Father, everything in the world around us wants us to show disloyalty to you, promises us happiness and draws our hearts away, and so therefore produces in us sin and ultimately death. Father, in Christ you have set our hearts free. We pray that this week we would thoughtfully, prayerfully learn to make choices that lead to life and not to death. Father, help us to encourage one another to do this together as a church family. And in all things, help us to fix our eyes on Christ, the one who has been perfectly obedient on our behalf, that we might belong to you and look forward to that crown of life that lasts forever. In Jesus' name, amen.